At 3 a.m., something unusual was happening in the Harding mansion. The billionaire, Victor Harding, was used to a life of luxury, power, and control. But tonight, he heard the soft clinking of dishes being washed, a sound that would stir something deep inside him. Walking quietly down the hallway, Victor was shocked to find Sofia, his maid's daughter, washing dishes alone in the kitchen. Her face, tired and drawn, didn't fit the pristine world he had built. But it wasn't just the late hour that caught his attention. It was the mystery behind why she was awake, why she was working in the dead of night, and why her words didn't add up. What started as a simple question, "Why didn't you go to school today?" would lead Victor on a journey he never expected. A journey into the truth about Sofia's family, about sacrifice, and about the ties that bind us all, no matter how distant we are. Where are you listening from? And if you enjoyed this story, please like the video and let me know in the comments section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and keep the conversation going. Victor Harding stood by the grand window of his penthouse, gazing out over the sprawling city below. His life, like the view before him, was flawless, orderly, controlled, and meticulously designed. At 42, he had everything a man could ask for: wealth beyond measure, a powerful position in the business world, and a mansion that seemed to touch the heavens. But despite all his success, there was an emptiness that lingered, a void that wealth couldn't fill. He had built his empire from the ground up, pushing others aside when necessary, never pausing long enough to feel the weight of his decisions. It was just after 3 a.m. when he heard it, the soft clink of dishes. Victor's gaze shifted from the city lights to the door that led into the kitchen. It wasn't a sound he often heard at this hour, especially not in his household. His staff, including Sofia, the maid's daughter, had always worked according to routine, daylight hours, never at night. Yet there it was again, the unmistakable sound of porcelain tapping against porcelain, followed by the steady hum of running water. He frowned. It wasn't unusual for Sofia to stay late helping out, but at this hour, it struck him as strange, out of place. His steps were quiet as he made his way down the grand hallway, the polished floors reflecting the dim lights of the hallway. When he reached the kitchen, he paused just outside the door, his shadow lingering on the floor. He couldn't help but feel a slight irritation bubble up, but at the same time, there was an odd curiosity. Sofia stood at the sink, scrubbing a plate, her back to the door. She wore a plain apron, her hair tied back in a messy bun, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the overhead light. She didn't notice him standing there, her focus solely on the task at hand. The sight of her, so quiet, so focused, was almost jarring to him. He cleared his throat, making his presence known. "Sofia." His voice was sharp but not unkind. It always carried that distant tone, a product of years spent in the boardrooms of the corporate world, where emotions were kept at arm's length. Sofia didn't jump, but she did flinch slightly, as if caught off guard. She turned slowly, her tired eyes meeting his. "Yes, Mr. Harding." Victor's gaze lingered on her. There was something about her that unsettled him tonight, her exhaustion, the tired lines on her young face, the way she seemed so out of place in the luxurious surroundings. "It's 3 a.m., he said, his voice softer now. "Why are you still up?" She hesitated, wiping her hands on the dish towel before speaking. I couldn't sleep, sir. I thought I might as well help out." Her voice was quiet, but there was no hint of defiance in it, just a quiet resignation. Victor studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slightly, his brow furrowing. It wasn't like her to work late, especially when there were other staff members available to do the work. Something about her response seemed off. "I'm sure you're tired. You've been working hard lately. Why didn't you go to school today?" Sofia's gaze faltered for a fraction of a second before she met his eyes again. She opened her mouth to speak but paused, as if carefully weighing her words. "I wasn't feeling well, sir. I thought it best to rest." Victor wasn't convinced. He had heard the faintest tremor in her voice, a crack in the calm exterior she always maintained. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The silence stretched between them. He opened his mouth to say something more, but just then, Sofia turned back to the sink and resumed washing the dishes, as if dismissing the conversation. Victor stood there for a moment, his thoughts swirling. He was used to control, to order, but this small act, this late-night dishwashing, felt like a disruption, something he couldn't ignore. He couldn't understand why it was bothering him so much. It was just a small thing, but for some reason, it lingered in his mind. He watched her for a few more seconds before turning and walking away, his mind racing with questions he hadn't expected to ask himself. Why was she still up? Why hadn't she gone to school? But more importantly, why did he care? The grand hallway stretched before him, the silence hanging thick in the air. He had a choice now. He could forget this moment, go back to the comfort of his perfectly controlled life, or he could find out what was going on. Something about the look in Sofia's eyes had unsettled him, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if ignoring it would be the right choice. Victor paused, his hand resting on the banister. His eyes flicked back to the kitchen, where Sofia worked, her figure now a shadow in the dim light. He knew that this would be the moment when everything changed, the moment when his carefully constructed world would begin to unravel. Victor Harding's steps grew heavier as he walked away from the kitchen, his mind racing. He had never given much thought to Sofia. She was just one of the many employees who worked for him. He didn't know much about her personal life, nor did he feel compelled to. She was efficient, polite, and unobtrusive, qualities he valued, but something about her had begun to linger in his thoughts. That moment in the kitchen wasn't just a passing oddity. It had stirred something inside him, a discomfort he couldn't shake. Why had she been awake at this hour? And why had she lied about not feeling well? Victor had no tolerance for lies. In his world, everything had a price, everything was measurable. People had their roles, and as long as they played them correctly, they remained invisible, useful. But now, here was Sofia, slightly off script, and for the first time he wondered if she had a life beyond her role as his maid's daughter. As he retreated to his study, Victor's mind wandered back to Sofia. She was different. There was a quiet resilience about her. She wasn't like the other employees who came and went in his life. Most of his staff were just nameless faces, easily replaced. But Sofia, despite her quiet demeanor, had made an impression, something deeper than he cared to admit. Victor didn't like this feeling. He had built his empire on control, on predictability, and most importantly, on maintaining emotional distance. People were tools, assets to be utilized and discarded as needed. Emotions were a weakness, a flaw he had worked hard to suppress. But this, Sofia's strange behavior, her distant eyes, and the flicker of vulnerability in her voice, it didn't sit well with him. He sank into his leather chair and stared out the window, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. The city lights blinked back at him, distant and indifferent. Yet in the midst of it all, Sofia's image loomed in his mind. Her tired face, the way she hesitated when answering his questions, it wasn't just exhaustion. There was something more, and he had no idea why he cared. He'd lived his life with certainty, never questioning, never wondering. Everything was predictable. But now this feeling was like a splinter in his mind, too small to remove yet impossible to ignore. His curiosity gnawed at him over the next few days, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on meetings, deals, and the constant flow of business that demanded his attention. Yet, whenever his thoughts wandered, they inevitably returned to Sofia. He'd see her occasionally, quietly performing her duties, but every time there was that nagging feeling that he couldn't shake. Why had she lied? Why had she stayed up so late washing dishes? That was the question that consumed him. It seemed trivial, almost beneath his concern. But he couldn't let go of it. It wasn't just about the lie. It was about something deeper, something buried beneath the surface that Sofia wasn't sharing. He had to know what it was. The next day, after an exhausting conference call, Victor found himself once again walking down the long hall of his mansion. He wasn't sure why he was doing this. There was no logical reason to approach Sofia about it, no business purpose. He didn't owe her an explanation, and yet the impulse was growing stronger by the minute. He found her in the kitchen just as before, this time, alone peeling vegetables for the evening's dinner. The sight of her so absorbed in her task seemed almost out of place in the grand surroundings of the Harding estate. Everything about Sofia screamed modesty, even though she lived in a world of luxury. Her worn apron, the way she moved with quiet purpose, the lack of any desire for recognition. It was as though she didn't belong here, as though she had slipped through some invisible crack in the world Victor had constructed. Victor hesitated at the door before stepping inside. He watched her for a moment, the sound of the knife against the cutting board filling the silence between them. Finally, he spoke. "Sofia," his voice broke the quiet. She looked up quickly, her eyes widening slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to speak to her. "Yes, Mr. Harding." "Sit down for a moment," he said, his tone less commanding than usual, almost tentative. She glanced at him, then back at the vegetables, unsure of how to respond. She'd never seen him act this way before. Finally, she set the knife down and slid into a chair across from him, the faintest trace of wariness in her posture. Victor sat down opposite her, his fingers resting on the edge of the table, his gaze fixed on her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. He was suddenly aware of the vast distance between them, one forged by years of privilege and subservience. But tonight, he couldn't ignore it. It was there, like an invisible barrier. "Why didn't you go to school today?" he asked, his voice quiet but insistent. Sofia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing down at her hands. For a moment, she said nothing. Victor waited, his eyes never leaving her. I didn't feel well, sir," she said again, her voice low. But the words felt rehearsed, as though she had said them many times before to others who didn't care enough to ask more. Victor leaned forward slightly, his gaze intensifying. "You didn't feel well," he repeated, his voice sharp now. "Is that all? You were up late washing dishes instead of resting." Her shoulders slumped ever so slightly, and she sighed, as if the weight of the lie had become too much to carry. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, I couldn't sleep. I thought it might help if I worked." Victor's mind raced. She wasn't telling him the full story, but why? He wasn't used to being lied to, especially not by someone in his employ. The more he looked at her, the more something felt out of place. There was a quiet desperation in her eyes, a look that told him there was much more than fatigue behind her actions, and it made him uneasy, more than he cared to admit. "You don't have to explain yourself to me, Sofia," he said, his voice suddenly softer. "But I know when something's not right. I want the truth." Sofia hesitated again, her fingers twisting the edge of the napkin on the table. Finally, she met his gaze, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. "It's just, my mom. She's been sick, Mr. Harding. I stayed home to take care of her. She's been getting worse lately, and I didn't want to worry anyone." Victor's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, everything around him seemed to fade as the weight of her words sank in. "I see," he said, his voice barely audible. The silence that followed was different now, filled with understanding and something else, something he couldn't quite define. He wanted to ask more. He wanted to know everything about her life, about what she had been through, but he didn't. Instead, he simply nodded and stood up, the moment stretching out between them. "Get some rest, Sofia," he said quietly, his tone returning to its usual sharpness. "You've earned it." As he turned to leave, he felt a strange weight settle in his chest. The world he had carefully built, the world where he kept everyone at arm's length, was beginning to feel fragile. There was something about Sofia, something buried deep within her, that had shaken him in a way nothing ever had before. And he wasn't sure if he wanted to know what it was, but he knew he would find out. Victor couldn't shake the feeling that something about Sofia's story didn't add up. He had given her a chance to come clean, to reveal the truth behind her lie, and yet she had only offered him fragments of the real story. Her mother was sick. That much was clear. But why hadn't she told him sooner? What was really going on? The next morning, as dawn broke over the city, Victor's mind was still consumed by the encounter in the kitchen. He found it hard to focus during his usual routine. Meetings felt distant, as if he were moving through them without truly being present. His thoughts kept returning to Sofia's quiet face, her eyes holding back something she wasn't willing to share. Unable to focus any longer, he decided to leave the office early. His car sped down the familiar streets, his mind on a singular mission. He had to know the truth. There was more to this than Sofia's sick mother. He had to get to the bottom of it. Victor had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to understand their motivations and control the narrative. Yet with Sofia, he felt completely blind. He didn't like the feeling. It made him feel exposed, vulnerable, an unfamiliar sensation for a man who had built his life on control. As he drove, an idea began to form. There was one place that held answers, a place where all the secrets of his past lay hidden, his father's old countryside estate. It had been years since he had last been there. His father had passed away, and the estate, once the heart of the Harding family legacy, now sat abandoned, filled with dusty memories and forgotten treasures. Victor's pulse quickened as he turned the car onto the winding road that led to the estate. The drive, though long and isolated, felt oddly comforting. The estate had always been a place of quiet reflection for him, a place where he could escape from the pressures of his daily life. But today, he wasn't coming for solitude. He was coming for answers. The sprawling mansion loomed ahead, its stone facade weathered with time. Victor parked in front of the grand entrance and stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes breaking the stillness of the afternoon. As he entered the mansion, the scent of old wood and dust filled his nostrils. It felt like stepping back in time. He made his way to his father's study, a room that had once been the heart of all Harding family business. But today, it was filled with remnants of the past, old journals, books, and photographs stacked carelessly on shelves. Victor's eyes scanned the room, his gaze settling on a faded journal resting on the edge of the desk. He knew it was his father. It had always been there, one of the few items his father had left untouched. Victor carefully opened the worn leather cover, the yellowed pages creaking as he turned them. It was then that he saw it, a photograph tucked between the pages of the journal. The image was old, the edges frayed with age, but the faces in the photo were unmistakable. There, standing side by side, were two women, one young and radiant, the other older but still strikingly beautiful. The first woman was his mother, her smile wide and carefree. The other woman, her face equally familiar, was none other than Amara, the maid's mother. Victor's heart skipped a beat. His eyes widened as the pieces began to fall into place. The woman who had raised Sofia's mother, the one he had written off as just another member of his staff, was someone from his own past, someone he had known before. He felt a rush of panic rise within him, his mind struggling to process the revelation. Amara had been his mother's best friend, the woman who had once stood by her side in the hardest of times. But how was it possible? How had he never known? How had his mother never mentioned this? Victor turned the photograph over, searching for any clues written on the back. There was nothing, no explanation, just the image of two women, arms around each other, standing in front of a backdrop of what looked like a humble home. Victor's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him like a freight train. Amara, the woman who had helped his mother when they had nothing, the woman who had supported them in their darkest hours, was the same person he had dismissed as just another burden, just another face in his household. He had never once considered the connection, never once thought to ask his mother about her. Victor stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. How had it come to this? How had he allowed his own family's history to slip through his fingers, only to be brought back into his life through a maid's daughter. The guilt he felt was overwhelming. He had been blind to the truth, and now it was too late to undo the damage. Without thinking, Victor turned and rushed out of the study, his footsteps echoing through the grand halls. He needed to see his mother. He needed to know the truth. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way back to the car. The estate suddenly felt suffocating, its walls closing in on him as he realized how much he had overlooked. Victor drove back to the city in a daze, his mind still reeling from the discovery. The photograph, the connection, it all made sense now. He had lived his life in a bubble, surrounded by wealth and power, and had failed to see the bonds that really mattered. Amara had once saved his family from ruin, and he had never once acknowledged it. The guilt weighed heavily on his shoulders as he parked in front of his mansion. He had to speak with his mother. He had to hear her side of the story. Victor walked briskly through the grand entrance and straight to his mother's room. He knocked lightly, then entered without waiting for a response. His mother was sitting by the window, gazing out at the garden below. She turned slowly as he stepped inside, her tired eyes meeting his. "Mother," Victor began, his voice softer than usual, filled with the weight of his discovery. "I need to talk to you." His mother's expression softened, sensing the urgency in his tone. "What's wrong, Victor?" Without saying a word, Victor pulled the photograph from his pocket and held it out to her. Her eyes widened as she took it from him, her fingers trembling slightly. "That's Amara," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "She was my best friend. When we had nothing, she gave us everything. I've searched for her for years, Victor." Victor stood in stunned silence. The truth, buried for so long, was finally coming to light. The woman who had raised Sofia's mother, the woman who had helped his family when they were on the brink of collapse, had been right in front of him all along. But now there was only one thing left to do. Victor stood in his mother's room, the weight of the photograph in his hand pressing down on him like a physical burden. The words his mother had spoken echoed in his mind. "She gave us everything." The woman he had written off as just another member of his household had been far more significant to his family than he had ever realized. Amara had been his mother's closest friend, someone who had helped them when they were on the brink of losing everything. His mother's eyes were still fixed on the photograph, a flood of memories washing over her as she clutched it in her hands. The air between them felt thick, and for the first time in years, Victor felt the true weight of the family secrets that had been buried under the years of wealth and privilege. "Why didn't you tell me about her?" Victor's voice was hoarse, edged with frustration and guilt. "Why didn't you ever mention her?" His mother's hand shook slightly as she placed the photograph down on the table. Her face softened as she met his gaze, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't think you would understand, Victor. Back then everything was so difficult. Amara saved us when we had nothing, when your father's business was failing, when we were living hand to mouth. She gave us her time, her energy, everything she had." Victor's brow furrowed, struggling to reconcile the image of his mother, the dignified, powerful woman who had always seemed untouchable, with the woman his mother was describing. "And you never told me." "I couldn't," she said, her voice breaking. "Your father was proud. He wouldn't have wanted anyone to know how much we struggled, but Amara never cared about pride. She cared about us, about me. She was always there. But after everything, after your father's death, I lost touch with her. I tried to find her, Victor, but I couldn't." Victor's heart clenched. The anger he had felt earlier started to morph into something else, a deep sense of regret, followed by a quiet admiration for the woman who had remained in the shadows of his family's life. He had never thought to ask about her, never taken the time to learn her story. Instead, he had distanced himself, assuming that the lives of those who served him were inconsequential. "What happened to her?" Victor's voice was strained with the urgency of his question. His thoughts raced back to Sofia's face, the same quiet strength he was now realizing ran in her bloodline. "She disappeared," his mother said softly, her voice distant as she looked down at the floor. I think she left because she felt used. Your father, he was a good man, but he didn't always show his gratitude. And after he passed, I was so caught up in everything, I didn't take the time to thank her properly. It's been so long, Victor. I've never been able to forgive myself." The words hit Victor like a punch to the stomach. Used. He hadn't just overlooked Amara, he had taken her for granted. And now, all these years later, he was just beginning to understand the depths of her sacrifice. He could only imagine how much she had given, how much she had suffered, without ever asking for anything in return. Victor's mind snapped back to the present. Sofia. The lie about being sick, the late-night dishwashing, it was all starting to make sense. Sofia was not just a maid's daughter. She was a woman whose family had endured so much for the sake of people like him, yet he had never once acknowledged it. He had never thought to ask about her life, her struggles, her sacrifices. Victor stood up abruptly, his mind racing with a new resolve. "I have to find her, Mother. I have to make this right." His mother's eyes widened, and for the first time in a long while a spark of hope seemed to flicker in them. "Victor, what are you saying? How can you—" "I'm going to find Amara," he interrupted, his voice steady with determination. "I'm going to find Sofia's mother, and I'm going to make things right." Victor's mother opened her mouth to speak but paused, the words caught in her throat. Her face softened as she watched her son, the man she had raised, finally showing signs of empathy, of understanding the depth of a bond he had long ignored. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, "but if you do, I know it will change everything." Later that evening, Victor sat in his study, staring at the photo of Amara and his mother once more. He wasn't sure how or where to start, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about making amends for past mistakes. This was about finding redemption for himself, for his mother, and for Sofia and her family. They had given so much, and he had done nothing but take. Victor spent hours that evening making calls, reaching out to any potential source who could help him find Amara. His mind, once clouded by the routine of wealth and business, was now laser-focused on one goal: to find the woman who had once saved his family. He could feel the weight of his decisions shifting. For the first time, he wasn't calculating profits or weighing business deals. He was reckoning with a deeper truth. He needed to find Amara. But more than that, he needed to make her see that he understood the sacrifices she had made, that he finally acknowledged what she had given up for the family he had taken for granted. The next morning, Victor arrived at Sofia's modest home early the next morning, his resolve firmer than ever. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he had to see her again. He had to make things right, even if he didn't know exactly how. He knocked gently on the door, his knuckles brushing against the wood with a quiet intensity. It took a moment before Sofia appeared, looking surprised to see him standing there. "Mr. Harding," she asked, her voice hesitant, "what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you, Sofia," Victor said, his voice steady but filled with an unfamiliar vulnerability. "It's about your mother." Sofia's face faltered slightly, a flash of concern crossing her features. She stepped aside to let him in, and as he entered her small home, he felt an overwhelming sense of shame. This wasn't his world. It wasn't the world he had built. But here, standing in front of Sofia and her humble life, he realized this was the world that truly mattered. Sofia led him to the living room where Amara sat, her face pale but her eyes sharp, watching Victor closely. The recognition in her eyes was immediate. There was no mistaking who he was. But Victor wasn't focused on the past. He wasn't focused on her ailing health. He was focused on what he had failed to see until now. "Amara," he said, his voice filled with reverence, "I owe you an apology, and I promise I will make things right." Sofia and Amara exchanged a glance, unsure of what he meant. But Victor wasn't leaving until they understood the depth of the debt he now felt to them both. Victor left Sofia's house with a heavy heart and a mind filled with newfound resolve. He wasn't sure how long it would take to find Amara, but he was willing to do whatever it took. Everything had changed in that one moment, standing in Sofia's modest home, seeing the quiet strength of her family, the very family he had taken for granted all these years. Now he had to fix it. He couldn't walk away this time. His first move was to reach out to his contacts. The Harding name held a lot of weight, and though Victor had spent most of his life focused on business, he knew that the right resources, private investigators, old acquaintances from his father's circle, could help him find Amara. By midday, Victor's office was buzzing with activity. Calls were made, records were dug up, and information began to trickle in. As he sat at his desk, reviewing the first set of responses, his thoughts wandered to Amara. Where was she? What had become of her after all these years? He had no answers, but one thing was clear: he was going to find out. Hours passed, and by the late afternoon, the first breakthrough came. One of his private investigators had traced a woman named Amara through an old address in the city. The lead seemed promising, but Victor wasn't about to jump to conclusions. He needed more. He pushed aside the stack of papers in front of him and stood up. "Get me a flight to that address. I want to meet her tomorrow." The next day, Victor found himself standing in front of a small, modest building in a quieter part of town. The area was nothing like the sprawling estate he called home. No towering skyscrapers, no lavish shops or restaurants. It was simple, unpretentious. Just the kind of place someone like Amara would have settled into after everything that had happened. He felt a wave of guilt rise in his chest as he looked at the rundown buildings around him. This wasn't a world he was used to, but for once it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt necessary. He entered the building, his footsteps echoing on the cracked tile floor. He was met by a middle-aged woman who appeared to be the manager. She looked him up and down, her eyes scanning him with suspicion. "Can I help you?" she asked curtly. Victor cleared his throat. "I'm looking for someone. Amara, do you know her?" The woman's face softened ever so slightly. "Amara? Yes, I know her. She doesn't come around much these days, but she used to live here. You might want to try asking the neighbors." She gestured toward the hallway. Victor nodded, thanking her before walking down the dimly lit corridor, his heart beating faster with each step. He knocked on the first door, and a middle-aged man answered. His face was worn, like someone who had seen a lot of life but still held onto a sense of warmth. "Excuse me," Victor began, his voice softer now. "I'm looking for Amara. Do you know where she is?" The man eyed him for a moment, his gaze wary. "Amara, you say? Sure, I know her. She used to live here with her daughter, but she doesn't come around much these days. I think she moved to a smaller place somewhere out of town." Victor felt his heart sink. Out of town. That was the lead he needed. If he could get an address, he might finally find her. But before he could ask for more details, the man continued. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, "she was always quiet, kept to herself. But from what I remember, she was a good woman, always helped out. I think she's been sick for a while, though. If you're really looking for her, you'll need to head to the outskirts to the little house by the lake. It's isolated, but I've heard that's where she's staying now." Victor's breath caught in his throat. The lake. He remembered it now. The house by the lake was a place his father had spoken about years ago, a retreat for those who wanted solitude. His father had often mentioned it in passing, but he had never paid it much attention. "Thank you," Victor said, his voice full of urgency. "Where exactly is it?" The man gave him directions, and Victor felt a surge of anticipation. This was it. This was the moment that everything hinged on. By the time Victor reached the lake house, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the landscape. The drive had been long and quiet, but now, as he pulled up to the isolated house by the water, he was acutely aware of the enormity of what he was about to do. He wasn't just looking for Amara. He was looking for answers, for redemption, for a way to fix the broken pieces of his past. The house was small, its exterior simple and weathered, blending into the surrounding landscape. The windows were dark and there was no sign of life, But Victor felt something stir inside him, a quiet hope that he hadn't felt in years. He knocked softly on the door, his pulse quickening. The door creaked open slowly, and standing in front of him was a woman, older now, her face marked by time and hardship. But her eyes, those same eyes, looked back at him with recognition. Amara, Victor's voice barely came out as a whisper. She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze piercing. Then, as if recognizing him, she nodded, her expression softening. "Victor Harding, I thought I'd never see you again." Victor took a deep breath, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. "I'm sorry for everything." Amara didn't speak at first. She just stood there, her eyes scanning him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in," she said softly. "You have a lot to answer for." As Victor entered the small house, the weight of his past seemed to settle around him, filling the space between them. This wasn't just about finding Amara. It was about understanding the sacrifices that had been made, the bonds that had been broken, and the life he had built without ever truly acknowledging those who had helped him along the way. Victor didn't know what to expect next, but he knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. Victor stepped into the dimly lit living room of the lake house, the door closing softly behind him. Amara had stepped aside to let him in, her eyes still fixed on him, but her expression was guarded. The air felt thick, and Victor couldn't help but feel that he was standing at a precipice, looking over the edge of a life he'd built on the backs of others, never fully understanding or appreciating the cost. The house was small but neat, with simple furnishings and a warmth that Victor hadn't expected. A crackling fire in the fireplace illuminated the room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was nothing like the grand estates he was used to. This was a life stripped down to its bare essentials, and for the first time, Victor felt a sharp pang of longing for something he couldn't name. Amara moved to the small kitchen and started preparing tea without saying a word. She was still the same quiet, composed woman, but the years had etched something new in her face. Hardship, loss, and survival had left their mark, but so had something deeper, a strength that had always been there, a resilience that had never faltered. Victor stood in the center of the room, unsure of what to do. He felt out of place, like an intruder in a life that wasn't his yet somehow was entwined with his own. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him, but he couldn't let it overwhelm him. Not now. He had come here for answers, for reconciliation, and he had to find the courage to face the truth. Amara turned to him, her hands wrapped around a simple ceramic mug, steam rising from the tea. "You've come a long way to apologize, Victor." Victor nodded, swallowing hard. "I've come a long way to make things right." She set the mug down on the small wooden table and motioned for him to sit. Victor hesitated but did as she asked, lowering himself onto the worn couch. There was an uncomfortable silence between them, one that stretched far longer than either of them expected. The fire crackled in the background, its warmth offering little comfort. Finally, Amara spoke. "You don't know what it's like to go without, do you?" Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that came from years of enduring hardship. "You've never had to wonder where your next meal would come from, or if you'd have enough money to pay the rent." Victor stiffened, but he didn't respond. She was right. He had never had to live that way. His entire life had been built on privilege. He had never had to fight for survival the way people like Amara had. She sat down across from him, her gaze unwavering. "I don't need your money, Victor." Her words cut through the air like a blade. "I never did." The bluntness of her statement took Victor by surprise. "Then why did you stay? Why didn't you leave when things got tough?" Amara's expression softened for a moment. "I stayed because your mother needed me." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I stayed because, in a world that didn't care, I was the one person who could offer something of value." Victor felt a rush of emotion swell within him: shame, guilt, admiration, and something else he couldn't name. He hadn't realized how much Amara had given, how much she had sacrificed, not just for his family but for his mother. His mother who had never told him any of this. How had he never known? "Why didn't you tell me?" Victor asked, his voice barely a whisper. Amara looked at him, her eyes still piercing, but there was a deep sadness in them now, a weariness that spoke of years of unspoken words. "I tried to tell you." She stood up and walked toward the window, her back to him. "But you were always too busy with your own life to listen." Victor's chest tightened at her words, and he looked down at his hands, his knuckles white from gripping the armrest of the chair. He knew what she meant. He had been so consumed by his world, his business, his wealth, that he had never even considered the lives of the people who worked for him. He had taken them for granted. Amara's voice broke through his thoughts. "I didn't want your pity, Victor." She turned back to face him, her gaze steady. "What I wanted, what I still want, is to be seen for who I am, not as a maid, not as a servant, but as a person." Victor looked up at her, his throat tight with emotion. He had no words for the years of neglect, the indifference he had shown, the privilege that had shielded him from seeing the truth. For the first time, he understood the weight of her words, the weight of everything she had carried alone. "I see you now, Amara." The words came out slow, deliberate. "I see what you've done, I see the sacrifices you've made, and I'm sorry I've been blind." Amara didn't say anything at first. She simply nodded as though acknowledging the truth of his words. "It's not just an apology I need, Victor." She moved closer to him, her eyes softening. "It's something more. It's about redemption. It's about healing the past, not just with words but with action." Victor swallowed hard. His chest felt heavy with the enormity of her statement. What could he do now? What could he possibly offer to make up for everything he had ignored? His mind raced, but one thing became clear. He couldn't just apologize and walk away. He had to make it right, and not just with Amara, but with Sofia too. "I'll do whatever it takes." The words came out with a new sense of determination. "I'm going to make it right, Amara, not just for you, but for your daughter too." Amara's eyes softened, but there was still a guarded look about her. "We'll see, Victor, we'll see." Victor stood up slowly, the weight of his promise sinking in. He didn't know how he was going to make things right, but he knew he had to try. He had to find a way to heal the wounds of the past. Amara walked to the window and stared out at the lake, the light from the setting sun casting a golden glow over the water. Victor joined her, standing beside her in silence. The road ahead was unclear, but for the first time he felt like he was on the right path. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, the kind that only comes when two people share the weight of the past, and the hope for a future that could be better than what came before. Victor turned to her, his voice soft but resolute. "I won't fail you, Amara. I won't fail your family." She didn't answer at first, but the faintest trace of a smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "We'll see." Victor stood still by the window, his gaze fixed on the shimmering water of the lake. The light from the setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, the stillness of the moment deepening the weight of what he had just promised. He had made a vow to Amara, but in truth, he wasn't sure how he was going to make it happen. He didn't even know where to begin. Amara's presence beside him was quiet, almost ethereal. The weight of her silence was no longer uncomfortable, but rather, it felt like a necessary pause, a moment of reflection. He hadn't expected it to be easy, and yet there was something about standing there with her, after all these years, that gave him a glimmer of hope. A new path had opened before him, one he had never imagined. "You've changed, Victor." Amara's voice was soft but firm. It caught him off guard. He had been lost in his thoughts, thinking of ways to fix things when her words pulled him back to the present. Victor turned to look at her, and for a moment their eyes locked, two people who had once been on opposite sides of an unspoken divide. "I have to change, Amara. I didn't realize how much I was blind to. I didn't understand anything." She nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the sincerity in his words. You're trying, Victor. That's what matters. For the first time in what felt like forever, Victor felt the weight of his past lift, even if only slightly. The guilt would remain, as would the mistakes he'd made, but there was a sense of resolve in him now, a clarity he hadn't felt before. I can't undo the past, he said, his voice heavy, but I can make sure the future is different, for you, for Sofia, for everyone I've failed. Amara studied him, her eyes searching for something, perhaps trying to measure the truth behind his words. For a moment, the air between them was thick with unspoken understanding. Then she spoke, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of resolve. Words are easy, Victor. She paused, her gaze unwavering. Actions speak louder. Victor nodded, understanding the weight of her statement. He knew he had to prove himself, not just to her, but to himself. He had spent too many years building his empire, focusing on everything but the people who truly mattered. His family, the ones who had been there when he had nothing, deserved more than empty promises. They deserved respect, acknowledgement, and care. Victor knew what he had to do. It wouldn't be quick, it wouldn't be easy, but he would make sure that Amara's sacrifices didn't go unrecognized anymore. The guilt gnawed at him, but there was a sense of determination in his chest now that had been absent before. I'll start by taking care of you, Amara. The words came out with a newfound conviction. I'll make sure you and Sofia are taken care of, health, housing, anything you need. And I'm not doing this out of pity. I'm doing it because it's the least I can do. Amara didn't flinch, but there was a glimmer of something in her eyes, perhaps recognition that he was finally beginning to understand. I don't want your charity, Victor. Her voice was low but firm. What I want is for you to see us, for who we are, not just what we do for you. Victor took a deep breath, her words sinking in. See us. It was so simple, yet he had never truly done it. It was always about what people could offer him, how they could benefit his life, his business. Now, for the first time, he was beginning to see Amara, Sofia, and the others around him as people, not tools for his success. I understand, he said quietly, the weight of those words shifting something inside him. I will. I promise you I'll see you. The next week, Victor threw himself into making things right. It was not an easy process, and he had to confront his own discomfort as he stepped further into a world he had long ignored. He arranged for top-tier medical care for Amara. He also found a new home for her, far from the small, modest space she had been living in. But beyond the material things, Victor realized that it wasn't just about what he could give them. It was about creating a new foundation for their relationship, one built on mutual respect, not on the power dynamics he had once taken for granted. Victor arranged to meet Sofia and Amara again, this time on his terms, not as a boss and his employee, but as equals. He invited them to the estate, but this time he wanted to show them something different. He wanted them to see that they were more than just part of his household staff. They were people who deserved respect, acknowledgement, and a place in his life beyond their service. When Sofia arrived with Amara, she was wary at first, unsure of what to expect. Victor met them at the door, a smile on his face that was both genuine and tentative. He gestured for them to come inside, and for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider in his own home. I want you both to know something, Victor began as they entered the large, elegant living room. The grandeur of the estate felt out of place now, too cold, too disconnected from the truth of what had transpired. I don't want you to feel like this is just a favor or that you owe me anything. This is about making things right. Sofia's eyes flicked between him and her mother, unsure of how to respond. But Amara spoke up before she could say anything. What do you mean, Victor? Victor took a step forward, his resolve stronger than before. I mean that I see you, not just as part of my household, not just as a maid and her daughter, but as people, real people. And I'm not just offering you money or things, I'm offering you respect. The room fell silent for a moment, and then Sofia's voice broke the tension. Thank you. Her voice was small but filled with emotion. Victor nodded, his heart swelling with the understanding that this was only the beginning. They had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time he felt like he was on the right path. There were no more barriers between them, just truth and the possibility of something better. That evening, as they sat down to dinner together, there was no distinction between them. No employer and employee. No wealthy man and his staff. Just a group of people sharing a meal, learning to rebuild something that had been broken long ago. Victor knew there was still a long way to go, but he was ready for it. For the first time in his life, he wasn't worried about the deals, the numbers, or the empire he had built. He was focused on what truly mattered: family, respect, and the chance to right his wrongs. The following weeks brought a sense of change to Victor Harding's life. The mansion, once filled with the cold echoes of wealth and power, now felt different. Sofia and Amara's presence, quiet, steady, was beginning to warm the space in ways Victor hadn't anticipated. His once meticulously ordered world was shifting, and for the first time in years it felt right. Victor had arranged for a private suite for Amara in a medical facility with some of the best doctors he could find. She had fought for so long, alone in her struggle, but now he wanted her to experience the care and comfort she deserved. Sofia, too, was no longer relegated to the background. She was taking evening classes at a nearby college, an opportunity Victor had ensured for her. He had promised to see them as people, and he had every intention of keeping that promise. But despite these efforts, Victor knew that healing wouldn't come easily, not for him, not for them. The wounds of the past were deep, and it wasn't just about money or resources. It was about trust, respect, and time. One evening, as the soft glow of the setting sun filtered through the windows of his study, Victor received a call from Sofia. Her voice was shaky, and the words she spoke stopped him cold. "Mr. Harding, Amara, she's asking for you." Victor didn't hesitate. The urgency in Sofia's voice told him everything. He quickly grabbed his coat and rushed out of the door. As he drove to the medical facility, his thoughts were a whirlwind. Amara's health had been fragile for so long, but he had hoped she was on the mend. The thought of losing her, losing this fragile connection that had begun to form, left a cold pit in his stomach. When he arrived at the facility, Sofia was waiting for him in the lobby, her face pale with worry. Without a word, she led him to Amara's room. Victor stepped inside, his heart pounding. Amara was sitting up in bed, her face tired, but her eyes still held the strength that he had seen in her from the very beginning. There was something about her, something that had always been so steady, so unshakable. Yet now it was clear that time and illness had taken their toll. "Amara," Victor said softly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I'm here. What do you need?" She looked up at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I just wanted to see you." Victor took a step closer, his heart heavy with emotion. The woman who had once saved his family was now lying here, her life slipping away. It was a cruel irony, and one that he had never fully understood until this very moment. "I'm sorry, Amara." Victor's voice cracked, and he found it difficult to keep his composure. "I should have been here sooner. I should have known what you were going through." Amara shook her head gently, her frail hand reaching out to him. "No, Victor, you're here now, and that's what matters." There was a long pause as Victor sat beside her, his thoughts swirling. He had done so much for her. He had arranged the medical care, the better living arrangements, and yet he still felt like he had fallen short. He had failed to understand her, to see the depth of her sacrifices, and now, with her time running out, he wasn't sure how to make it right. "I wish I could have done more for you, Amara." His voice was barely above a whisper. "You've given me so much, and I've taken it all for granted." Amara's eyes softened, her smile gentle despite the exhaustion that clouded her face. "Victor, I don't need your apologies. I don't need your money. I needed you to see me, and for the first time in your life, I think you really do." Victor swallowed hard, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. The simplicity of her request, of her need for recognition, hit him like a tidal wave. It wasn't about grand gestures or luxuries. It was about acknowledgement. You've given me everything I could never have understood before, Amara. He reached out, taking her hand in his grip firm but tender. And I'll carry that with me. I promise I will. She squeezed his hand lightly, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and peace. That's all I wanted, Victor. Victor stayed with Amara for hours, talking to her about everything and nothing. They shared memories, regrets, and unspoken truths. As the night wore on, Amara began to drift in and out of sleep, her breathing shallow. Sofia remained by her side, a silent witness to their quiet exchange. It wasn't the grand, dramatic reconciliation that Victor had imagined, but it was something far more meaningful. The next morning, Victor returned to his mansion early the next morning, the weight of the previous night's events still pressing on him. He had witnessed Amara's grace in the face of death, and it had changed him in ways he hadn't fully grasped until now. He knew what he had to do. Sofia was waiting for him when he arrived at the estate. Her face was somber, but there was something different in her eyes, perhaps a new understanding, a new trust. As she stood in the hallway, her posture straight but not rigid, Victor walked toward her. I want to make this right, Sofia. His voice was steady, filled with the certainty of his resolve. I know that money and promises won't fix what's happened, but I want you and your mother to know that I'll always be here for you, for both of you. Sofia looked at him, her eyes flicking from his face to the floor. She didn't answer right away, and Victor could feel the weight of the silence between them. But then, slowly, she nodded. Thank you, Mr. Harding. Her voice was quiet, but there was no trace of the wariness that had once existed between them. There was just a quiet understanding now, the beginning of a new chapter. Victor placed his hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture of solidarity and respect. Call me Victor. For the first time in their relationship, Sofia met his eyes with a look of true trust. Days later, Amara passed away quietly in the night, surrounded by the people who cared for her. Her passing was peaceful, and though the sorrow weighed heavily on Victor, he felt a strange sense of relief. She had asked for nothing but recognition, and now, in the end, she had received it. Victor sat in the small room where Amara had spent her final days, reflecting on everything he had learned. He had spent years building his empire, climbing higher and higher, but it had been empty. His success had been hollow without the people who mattered most. Amara, Sofia, and even his mother had shown him a different way of living, one where actions mattered more than words and respect was more valuable than wealth. Victor knew that the road ahead would be long and the healing would take time, but he was ready. He had made his promises and he would keep them, not just to Amara and Sofia, but to himself. And for the first time in his life, Victor Harding understood what it truly meant to be wealthy. The funeral for Amara was simple but dignified, the kind of service that spoke volumes without needing to be lavish. Victor stood at the back of the small gathering, watching as Sofia stood beside her mother's casket, her eyes red from crying but her posture strong. Amara had been a rock for them both, and now, with her gone, Sofia was the one who carried that strength forward. Victor had never imagined himself at a service like this. His world, once dominated by business meetings, luxury, and power, had always kept him distant from such personal grief. But now, as he stood there watching Sofia, something inside him shifted. This wasn't just a ritual, this was a recognition of Amara's life, the impact she had had on everyone around her, and the legacy she left behind. It wasn't about wealth, it wasn't about status. It was about the human connections that formed the bedrock of everything. As the ceremony concluded, Victor made his way over to Sofia. Her eyes met his, and though there was no immediate warmth, there was no hostility either, just a quiet understanding between them. Thank you for being here, Mr. Harding. Sofia's voice was soft but steady, the raw emotion of the past days still evident in her tone, but there was a new layer of respect there as well. Victor nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the past but lighter somehow in the presence of Sofia. "I promised Amara I'd be here for you, and I meant it." Sofia hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "She would have been happy to know you kept your word." The simplicity of the statement struck Victor more than he expected. He had spent so many years working to live up to his own expectations, to the demands of his business empire, that he had forgotten what it meant to live up to someone else's needs, to be seen not as a benefactor, but as a person who simply did the right thing, not out of obligation, but because it was right. Victor stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. The road to redemption wasn't linear, and he knew that. There was so much he still needed to make right, not just with Sofia, but with others in his life, with himself. "I don't know if I can undo all the damage I've caused," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "But I'll do whatever it takes to try." Sofia's gaze softened as she looked at him, something new in her eyes now, acceptance perhaps. "You're already doing it, Mr. Harding." Victor nodded, finally understanding. It wasn't just about money, grand gestures, or grand promises. It was about consistency, about showing up and being present, not just in the easy moments but in the hardest ones too. It was about truly seeing people, not for what they could offer but for who they were. Months later, Victor's life had changed in more ways than he could count. The mansion was no longer just a symbol of his success. It was a home, filled with warmth, honesty, and real connections. Sofia had completed her studies and was now working in a position she loved, one where she could make a difference, just as Amara had always wanted for her. Victor had even invited Sofia and Amara's memory into his family in a way he had never thought possible. He and his mother, who had grown frail in the years since Victor's father passed, had found a new connection. They no longer just shared a name, they shared understanding. And while Victor had lost Amara, he had gained something far more important: the realization of the power of the relationships he had overlooked for far too long. Victor's business success hadn't faded, but something inside him had shifted. He no longer worked for the thrill of power or the next deal. Instead, he worked to build a legacy that wasn't defined by wealth, but by the impact he could have on others. He had begun to invest in causes that mattered to him, helping those who had been marginalized, the way Amara had once helped him and his mother. One evening, as Victor sat in his study, reflecting on how far he'd come, there was a soft knock at the door. He looked up to find Sofia standing there, her expression warm yet serious. "Mr. Harding, Victor," she smiled slightly, her tone more familiar now than it had ever been. "There's someone who wants to meet you." Victor raised an eyebrow but stood up nonetheless. He followed Sofia down the hall to the living room, where a young girl was waiting. She couldn't have been more than 15, and her eyes shone with the same quiet strength that Sofia had always carried. Sofia introduced her with a soft smile. "This is Amara's granddaughter. She's come to live with us. I thought you might want to meet her." Victor stood still for a moment, his heart swelling with emotion. Amara's granddaughter. Sofia had found her family, and now, so had he. He had finally learned what it meant to give back, to connect with the people who mattered. Victor smiled, stepping forward to greet the young girl. "It's nice to meet you," he said, his voice warm. "Amara would be proud of you." As they sat together, exchanging stories and laughter, Victor looked around at the people in his life. These weren't just employees or acquaintances. These were people who had shaped him, people who had shown him what truly mattered. For the first time, Victor Harding felt whole. This was what success meant. Victor Harding had spent his life building an empire, but it had always felt like something was missing. Now, after everything, after learning from Amara, Sofia, and his own mistakes, he had found the missing piece. It wasn't power. It wasn't wealth. It was the people who stood beside him, the ones he had taken for granted for so long. As he looked at Sofia and her family, he knew that the road to redemption was long and winding, but it was one he was willing to walk. For the first time in his life, Victor understood the true value of connection, the power of seeing people for who they truly were, not just for what they could offer him. And as the years passed, he made a silent promise to himself. He would never again take the important things in life for granted. He had finally learned what it meant to give, to listen, and to love, not just with words but with actions. The end.